In the summer of 1971, on a gravel road outside of Dumas, Texas, a 38-year-old woman named June Alderton stopped her truck at the edge of a field that had not produced a decent crop in 6 years and decided she was going to do something that nobody in Moore County had tried on purpose. The field belonged to her, all 3,200 acres of it. It had belonged to her father before her and his father before him. And the Alderton family had been farming and grazing that country since 1924, when June's grandfather had broken sod on the Canadian River Plain and planted the first winter wheat the county extension agent had ever seen come in clean on that particular stretch of land. The country was good country, deep soils, reliable winds, a reasonable number of frost-free days if the calendar cooperated. The problem was the water. The Ogallala Aquifer ran under the Texas Panhandle like a buried ocean. Farmers had been pumping it since the 1940s, first with small centrifugal pumps that lifted enough water to wet a garden, then with the big turbines that came after the war, the ones that could pull 10,000 gallons an hour from 300 feet down and spray it across a quarter section in one pass. By 1965, the water table under Moore County had dropped 40 feet. By 1970, it had dropped another 30. The wells that had irrigated 6,000 acres of corn and grain sorghum in 1955 were now pumping slower, costing more, and producing less. June's father, a quiet man named Raymond Alderton, had watched the water table drop for 20 years and had said nothing in public about what he thought it meant. He said it to June instead, in the evenings, on the porch, when the wind had settled and the sky over the caprock went colors that had no name in English. "This country is spending money it does not have," he told her once. "We are borrowing from something that does not give loans." Raymond died in 1968. He left June the land, the equipment, 3 pivot irrigation systems that were costing her $800 a month in electricity to run, and a filing cabinet full of soil records he had kept since 1931, noting rainfall, soil moisture, crop yield, and groundwater depth twice a year with a hand pump and a weighted string. He had never told a neighbor about the records. He had never presented them at a Farm Bureau meeting. He had kept them the way a doctor keeps patient notes, because the data mattered whether anyone else was looking at it or not. June kept the records going. She added her first entry on a Tuesday in March of 1969, and she had not missed a recording since. By 1971, what the records told her was not comfortable. The groundwater under the east section was down to usable depth only in the deepest quarter. The center pivot on the north field was pulling sand on dry years. If she kept irrigating at current rates, she had, by her calculation, approximately 12 to 15 years of economically viable pumping left on 2/3 of her acreage. After that, the water would still be there, but it would cost more to lift it than the crops would sell for. Every other farmer in Moore County was looking at the same aquifer and making the same calculation and arriving at a different conclusion. The conclusion most of them arrived at was that the water would last, that new technology would come, that the extension office would figure something out, that the government would fund deeper wells, that it would rain more in the future than it had in the past. These conclusions were not based on data. They were based on a preference for not thinking about the alternative. June had thought about the alternative for 3 years before she acted on it. She had been reading, not the Texas A&M bulletins, which mostly confirmed what every county agent already knew. She had been reading papers from Israel, from Australia, from the dry farming districts of the Pacific Northwest, from researchers at Kansas State. who were working on winter wheat varieties that could produce a reasonable yield at 60% of normal irrigation inputs. She had been reading about dry land farming, about deficit irrigation, about cover crops, and soil organic matter, and the relationship between root depth and moisture retention in sandy loam soils. What she understood, after 3 years of reading, was this: the farms around her were not failing because of drought. They were failing because they had been built to require water that was not going to be there. The solution was not to find more water. The solution was to need less. That was the idea. The idea had a name in the Israeli papers. They called it precision deficit irrigation. But June did not use that phrase in Dumas because nobody would have known what it meant, and she would have sounded like she was showing off. She just called it using less water on purpose. Using less water on purpose, applied to the right crops in the right rotation at the right time, in a way that kept the soil alive and the root systems deep enough to find moisture. The pivot systems were not even reaching. Her neighbor to the north was a man named Lester Pruitt. Lester was 63 years old in 1971 and had been farming the same section since 1948 and had opinions about farming that were fully formed and not accepting new members. He came over one evening in late August when June had shut down her north pivot 2 weeks earlier than normal and found her walking the field with a soil probe. "You broke down?" he asked. "No," June said. Lester looked at the pivot sitting idle at the end of its pipe. It was a hot evening. The corn on his side of the fence was still being watered. Her corn was not. "You're going to lose that stand," he said. She pushed the probe into the soil and pulled a core and looked at it. The moisture was still there, 12 inches down. The plants were stressed, but not dying. The roots were looking for water and finding it where the pivot had never put it. "Maybe," she said. Lester stood at the fence for a while. He was not an unkind man. He was a man who had learned farming from his father and trusted what he had learned, which was a reasonable thing to do when what you had learned was working. He was watching it stop working, and he did not yet understand why. "You want me to run you a line from my well?" he asked. She thanked him and said no. He drove back to his place. June kept walking the field with the probe. By October, her corn yield was down 14% from the previous year. She had expected 12. She wrote the number in the records and noted the soil moisture readings at harvest and the electricity cost for the season, which was 22% lower than 1970. The net on the field, accounting for reduced yield and reduced pumping cost, was within $8 an acre of the previous year. She had not told Lester this. She had not told anyone. In the spring of 1972, she converted the south section entirely. She planted dry land wheat and a cover crop mix she had gotten from a researcher at Kansas State, a combination of winter rye, hairy vetch, and turnips that the researcher had been trialing in western Kansas for 4 years. The cover crop was not going to produce income. It was going to produce soil. It was going to keep the ground covered through the summer fallow period, fix nitrogen from the air, and break down into organic matter that would hold moisture the way a sponge holds water, slowly, from the inside. Her dryland wheat neighbor to the south, a woman named Opal, who had been watching June's place for years without saying much, stopped at the road one afternoon and looked at the green fuzz of vetch coming up between the wheat rows. "What is that?" she asked. "Cover crop," June said. "What for?" "The soil." Opal looked at it for a while. Opal had been dry farming that section since her husband died in 1961, and she had kept it running by being careful with money and not taking chances. She was not unfriendly. She was not going to put green fuzz in her wheat rows without a better explanation than the soil. "You're going to disc that in?" Opal asked. "In the spring, yes." Opal nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they are being polite about something they think is a mistake. She drove on. The cover crop came up through the fall and winter. June did not disc it in the spring. She let it grow until it began to compete with the wheat. Then she crimped it flat with a roller she had modified herself from a plan in an Australian no-till farming journal. The crimped cover crop lay flat on the soil surface like a mat, blocking evaporation, blocking weeds, breaking down slowly in the heat. The wheat grew up through it. Lester Pruitt drove by in April and stopped for a long time. He did not get out of his truck. He looked at the field from the road, which looked, from the road, like a mess. A field of wheat coming up through dead brown tangles of vetch and rye, like something that had not been properly cleaned up after winter. He drove on without knocking. The wheat came in at 91% of the county average yield, with no irrigation, in a year when the county average required 2.5 inches of applied water per acre. June's electricity bill for that section was 0. She did not say anything about this at the co-op. She wrote the numbers in the records. By 1974, she had converted a second section to the deficit irrigation protocol and expanded the dryland cover crop rotation to include a summer cash crop of grain sorghum following the wheat. The sorghum was bred for drought tolerance, a variety out of a USDA program in Lubbock that nobody else in Moore County was planting because the yield ceiling was lower than conventional sorghum under full irrigation. Under full irrigation, that was true. Under the water conditions coming at Moore County in the next decade, the yield ceiling comparison was going to look different. The groundwater kept dropping. 2 cents a gallon to pump in 1971, 4 cents in 1974. The electrical cooperatives in the Panhandle were running load-shedding programs in peak irrigation months because the pump load had outgrown the grid. June's pump load had dropped 40% from her 1968 baseline. Nobody had noticed yet because her fields looked different from her neighbors' fields, and different in Moore County in 1974 read as wrong. She had hired a hand in 1972, a young man from Stratford named Wendell Coe, who had grown up on a dry land operation in the eastern Panhandle and was not afraid of a field that did not look manicured. Wendell was 24 years old, quiet, and had an instinct for soil that June recognized because her father had had the same instinct. He could push a probe into the ground and pull a core and know things about it that the laboratory at A&M would have confirmed 2 weeks later. She told him what she was doing and why on his second week of work. She showed him the records going back to 1931. She showed him the water table numbers. Wendell looked at the numbers for a long time. "How long does the county have?" he asked. "If they keep pumping the way they're pumping," June said, "maybe 20 years before it gets expensive enough to change behavior. Maybe less. And us?" She had already done the calculation. I can run this operation on 30% of current water use within 5 years. After that, the sections with the deepest soil will produce without irrigation indefinitely. The sandy north section will need management." Wendell looked at the records. He looked at the fields through the window. He looked back at the records. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. That was 1972. In 1977, June converted the last irrigated section to a modified deficit protocol that used one pivot on a 3-week cycle instead of the standard 7-day cycle, pulling water only at critical growth stages and relying on soil moisture reserves and cover crop residue the rest of the time. Her total water use for the year was 28% of her 1968 baseline. Lester Pruitt had not spoken to her about her fields since 1972. He had not been unfriendly. He had been the particular kind of busy that farmers get when they do not want to discuss something. His own operation was expanding. He had drilled 2 new wells in 1975 to replace declining production in the old ones. The new wells cost $40,000 each. He had taken a loan. Others in the county had done the same. The 1970s were good years for commodity prices in general. The export market was strong. Corn and grain sorghum were profitable enough that the cost of deeper wells could be absorbed, could be rationalized, could be filed under investment rather than symptom. June watched and said nothing. In 1978, the Texas Department of Water Resources published a report on the High Plains aquifer decline that said, in language that a county agent could explain to a farmer in 20 minutes. But it was a dry July that the water table under the southern High Plains had dropped an average of 58 feet since 1950 and was projected to fall another 30 to 40 feet by 1990 under current pumping rates. The report recommended conservation practices. It did not mandate them. The Farm Bureau noted the report and passed a resolution supporting voluntary conservation. Nobody changed how they watered. June read the report in her kitchen on a Thursday night and put it in the filing cabinet next to her father's 1952 water table measurements and went to bed. The summer of 1980 came in hot and dry, which was not unusual for the Texas Panhandle in August. What was unusual was that it came in hot and dry after a winter with 40% of normal snowpack and a spring with 60% of normal rainfall, which meant the soil profile going into growing season was already short. The irrigation systems ran longer than budgeted. Electricity bills in July were the highest ever recorded by the Southwestern Public Service Company in the Panhandle District. It did not break that year. It broke in 1983. The winter of 1982 to 1983 was dry. The spring of 1983 was dry. June had planted her dryland sections in the fall, and they had germinated on stored moisture and thin December rain and come up sparse but alive. Her irrigated sections were on the deficit schedule, pulling from wells that had not been stressed by winter pumping, going into the season with full aquifer pressure. Her neighbors had run their systems through November, trying to bank moisture for spring. Their wells were tired going into March. The rain did not come in April of 1983. It did not come in May. The Canadian River ran the lowest June had ever seen it in 40 years of watching it. The sky over the caprock was that particular shade of white that means no clouds are forming and none are coming. By June, Lester Pruitt's corn was burning, not from lack of effort. He was pumping everything his wells had. The wells were giving him 60% of their 1975 output at twice the electrical cost. He was applying water and watching it evaporate before it could reach roots that had never been trained to go looking for it. June's dryland wheat had already been harvested in May. It had come in at 83% of the county average in a year when the county average was going to be a fiction, because half the county's irrigated corn was going to be a total loss. Her grain sorghum was planted and waiting. Her cover crop residue was holding moisture in the soil profile that no amount of expensive pumping could replace, because it was not surface moisture. It was structural moisture, built into the organic matter of a soil that had been managed for 12 years to hold water the way a cistern holds rain. Wendell walked the sorghum field with her in late June. The plants were shorter than they would have been under full irrigation. They were not dying. They looked stressed, he said. They are stressed, June said. They'll produce. He walked a few more rows. He had seen stressed crops that produced and stressed crops that didn't, and he knew the difference. These were going to produce. How much? He asked. Enough. By August. The situation in Moore County had a name. The Extension Office was calling it a drought. The newspapers in Amarillo were calling it a crisis. The USDA had declared 9 Panhandle counties disaster areas. Emergency hay was being trucked in from Kansas. Farmers, who had borrowed against good commodity prices in 1978 and 1979, were now facing crop failures on top of debt service on wells that were costing more to run than the crops were worth. Lester Pruitt sold his North Quarter section in September. He had farmed it since 1955. The buyer was a corporate operation out of Oklahoma City that had been buying distressed Panhandle acreage all summer at prices that reflected the distress. June did not sell an acre. Her grain sorghum came in at 71% of a normal irrigated yield with 28% of normal water input. The net margin per acre was positive. In a year when half of Moore County was filing for disaster assistance, her operation had a positive net margin. She drove past Lester's north section in October. The field was empty. The corporate buyer had not planted anything. They were going to wait for prices to recover. She sat in her truck on the road for a while. She was not gloating. Lester Pruitt was a good man who had farmed hard for 30 years and had done what everyone around him was doing and had lost something he was not going to get back. That was not a joke. That was a thing that happened to people who were running on assumptions that stopped being true. Wendell found her at the kitchen table that evening with the records spread out in front of her. She had pulled her father's entries from the 1930s, the years of the Dust Bowl, and laid them next to her own entries from 1970 through 1983. Raymond Alderton had written, in his careful hand, on August 14, 1936, soil blowing from fallow fields to east and south. 3 inches topsoil loss estimated on the Williams section. Water table unchanged. Dryland wheat still standing on the home place. The key is the roots. June had written on August 22, 1983. Sorghum harvest complete. Yield 71% normal. Net positive. Cover crop residue held moisture at 18-inch depth through June and July. No topsoil loss. Water table on east section up 3 feet from spring reading due to reduced pumping. The key is the roots. Wendell read both entries. He did not say anything for a long time. Your father knew, he finally said. Not about the cover crops. He never used cover crops. June set down her pencil. He knew the soil was talking and that listening to it mattered more than fighting it. That's what he gave me. Wendell nodded. He had worked for June for 11 years by then. He had watched neighbors lose ground, watched wells decline, watched men take loans on equipment they needed to chase a water table that was always going to be one drill bit ahead of them. He had worked every day on a farm that looked wrong from the road and had never lost a crop to drought. After the 1983 season, the word got around Moore County in the way that real things get around after a disaster, slowly, without humor, carried by men standing at fences with their hats in their hands. June Alderton had come through it. Not because she was lucky, not because her section was wetter, but because she had been farming on less water for 12 years, and her soil was different because of it. 3 neighbors drove up her road in the fall of 1983, not to argue, not to laugh. To walk the fields and ask questions she answered without lecture, showing them the cover crop rotation, showing them the soil cores, showing them the records going back to her father's entries and further to her grandfather's notes from 1931. One of them, a younger man named Gordon Taft, who was farming his father's section north of town, stood in the middle of the dry-land wheat stubble and looked at the cover crop coming up through it and was quiet for a long time. "How long before this changes the soil?" he asked. She had thought about that. 3 years before you see it in the moisture readings. 5 years before you see it in the yield during a dry year. Gordon looked at the field. He was 31 years old. He had taken over the operation from his father the year before and had inherited 2 declining wells and a debt load that assumed commodity prices were going to stay where they were in 1980. "What do I need to start?" he asked. She told him. She told him the same thing she had done in 1972, the same crop mix, the same probe schedule, the same records protocol. She gave him the name of the researcher at Kansas State who had sent her the original variety trials. She did not tell him it was going to be easy. She told him it was going to look wrong to everyone around him for 2 or 3 years, and then it was going to look different. And then, when the next dry year came, it was going to look like the only thing that made sense. Gordon started that fall. His neighbor laughed at the vetch in his wheat rows the following spring. He kept going. In 1988, the Texas Panhandle Water Conservation Authority published a new assessment of the Ogallala decline. Under the current management trajectory, they projected that 40% of the southern high plains would be economically non-irrigable within 25 years. They recommended transitioning to dryland and low-water farming systems. They cited, in a technical appendix, a small body of research on cover crop rotations and deficit irrigation that had been running in the western Kansas and Texas Panhandle region since the early 1970s. June read the report. She recognized the data. Some of it was data she had sent to the Kansas State researcher in 1974, incorporated into his trials, published in a journal she had read when she sent it and not thought about since. She filed the report next to the 1978 assessment and went back to work. In 1991, the Moore County Farm Bureau asked June to speak at the annual meeting. She was 58 years old and had never spoken publicly about her farming methods. She had shown her fields to anyone who drove up the road and asked. She had answered questions at the fence. She had mailed photocopies of her father's soil records to 3 neighboring farmers who asked for them. She had not given a speech. She almost said no. Wendell told her she should go. She stood at the podium in the VFW hall in Dumas with a single page of notes. She looked at the notes once. Then she put them in her shirt pocket and spoke from the records she had been keeping for 22 years, and her father had been keeping for 37 years before her. "Farmers in this county are losing their water," she said, "not because of drought. Drought is what we've always had. We're losing it because we built our operations to require more than the aquifer can replace. And then we made it a moral failure to use less." The room was quiet. "I started deficit irrigation in 1971, she said. "My corn yield dropped 14% the first year. My electricity cost dropped 22%. I did not tell anyone because there was nothing to tell until I knew if it was going to hold. By 1977, I had reduced my total water use to 28% of what I was using in 1968. My yields were within 10% of my irrigated neighbors on corn and within 2% on wheat. My wells were not declining. Theirs were." She paused. "In 1983, my operation had a positive net margin. I know what some of yours looked like in 1983. I am not saying this to embarrass anyone. I am saying it because the 1983 drought was not a surprise. My father's records predicted it. Not that year, not that month, but that the water was going to run short and that the farms built to need the most water were going to fail. First, that was predictable in 1968. It is predictable now for whatever is coming in the next 20 years. She paused again. My father never used a cover crop. He never ran deficit irrigation. He was a conventional farmer who kept meticulous records and had the honesty to read what those records said. What they said was that this country requires patience and restraint and a willingness to take less in the good years so you have something left in the bad ones. That is not a farming technique. That is a relationship with land. The room was quiet for a moment, and then Gordon Taft started clapping, and most of the room. And then others joined him. Lester Pruitt was there. He had sold the North Quarter in 1983 and had kept the home section running on the remaining wells. But he was 63 years old and tired in the way that men get tired when the work stops matching the result. He found June in the parking lot afterward. I should have listened in 1972, he said. June looked at him. He was not a man who said things like that. It had cost him something to say it. You were doing what everyone else was doing, she said. That's not a good enough reason. He put his hat on. I knew your water bills were going down. I saw your fields. I told myself you were going to lose yield, and when you didn't lose it, the way I expected, I told myself it was your soil type. June had known that. She had always known that. It's hard to change what you learned from your father when what you learned worked for a generation. Lester nodded. He was looking at the parking lot. He had been doing that lately, looking at surfaces instead of horizons, which was a thing June had noticed in men who were running out of future to look toward. Your father knew something the rest of us didn't, Lester said. He knew the country was telling him something, June said. He just made sure to keep quiet enough to hear it. Lester drove home. June drove home. The cover crop on the south section was 2 weeks from being crimped. The water table on the east section had risen 6 feet since 1983 under the reduced pumping regime. The soil records that Raymond Alderton had started in 1931 were in their 61st year. June would add her entry for 1991 in December, the way she always did, noting rainfall, soil moisture, crop yield, and groundwater depth. The entry for December 1991 would read, wheat established well on all dryland sections. Cover crop at full stand on south and center. Groundwater east section 247 feet, up 11 feet from 1983 low. First year net margin above 1980 baseline since 1985. Roots holding. She did not know it in 1991, but the farm would still be running in the next century, and the one after that, on water that had not run out because someone had decided, in a hot August in 1971, that the difference between what the land required and what it could give was not a problem to solve by digging deeper. It was a relationship to repair by asking less. 60 years of records in 4 filing cabinets. 2 women and 1 man who kept them without being asked. 1 farm on the Canadian River Plain that had not lost a crop to drought in 20 years, in a county that had lost thousands of them. The key, Raymond Alderton had written in 1936, is the roots. He had meant the wheat. June had understood he meant everything.